of truth.
I feel there's an elephant in the room that I have to address again. Just a prefatory note. I have spent the vast majority of my adult life defending Christians and Christianity, and many, many Christians know this. It's very important for me to say that. Many Christians, maybe most, for many years read this and thought the Jews are Christ killers.
It's convenient for them.
Well, why wouldn't they think that, especially in light of this odd claim that the mob would say, let his blood be on us and our descendants? Who says that? I've never heard that. Is that a normative thing when people wrongly kill somebody? Let my descendants suffer?
Well, that just shows you how carried away. So the first thing I would say is that this is the mob that does this. It's not the Jews, it's the mob.
But it was read as the Jews.
I know, but that's very convenient for religious hypocrites who want to vent their psychopathy and put a moral cast on it. This is the mob. And if a mob is insane enough, they'll sacrifice even the future to their demented psychopathic whims. And that's what you see here. The mob is so irresponsible that they're not only sacrifice themselves in their bloodlust, but also their children.
They're calling for the mark of Cain, the generational mark. But didn't the Vatican have a ruling in the 60s or 70s that made clear this differentiation, at least within the Catholic Church?
That was 1,960 years later.
That statement, whether it is a very strange statement to say, right? It is something very odd. When I see that, I don't see that as a moral statement. It has very little moral bearing. I tend to see that as something that is simply declaring maybe I can ask this to you. What they said, is that what happened? Did this event end up following Jews until today? Is it something that's part of, let's say, the struggle of even being a Jew today? Is that something that's real in the life of Jews? I'm not saying that this is any kind of moral grandstanding. It's just, I think that there is a very strange prophetic element to what is being said here, and that will not to the glory of anybody, not to the glory of Christians, but that it is something that happened.
It happened because Christians made it happen. It didn't happen. It's like, when kids spill grape juice on a white tablecloth, they say the juice spilled. The kids spilled the juice. Christians killed Jews for a lot of years, not all Christians. And by the way, I point out to Jews, so it's worth noting here too, that for example, when the Christian Crusaders went to the Holy Land to recapture it from Muslims, which by the way, because I'm a big believer in truth, I don't find morally problematic that Christians would want to recapture what had been captured from them. But on the way to the Holy Land, Crusaders slaughtered entire cities of Jews in Germany. And their basic thesis was, hey, we're fighting the infidel there, let's fight the infidel here. So the history of Christian anti-Semitism is intense. At the same time, I point out to people, because again, I really, really, really love truth, Jews did try to hide in bishops' homes. And bishops generally gave them sanctuary in their homes. This was most of the time the mob, the Christian mob.
Yeah.
We're back to mobs again.
Yeah.
There's no such thing as a Christian mob.
because they're not really Christian.
I mean, there's
Right,
no
yes,
question.
but
I get the point.
yeah,
but-
you get it right.
Oh,
People
definitely.
identifying as Christians.
Christ is a master at using short, mysterious stories. They change the listener who takes them seriously.
The person that you do not think could ever be virtuous, well, let me show you. This is the person who is fulfilling the law and the prophets.
I don't believe in that promise. I'll just be honest at this point.
Then it hit me. I saw it.
This Jew is very frightened of a post-Christian society.
The power of love.
I don't want to be in a Hallmark card, I tell you.
We've got our work cut out for us, gentlemen. I sure hope we're up to the task. Well, it's also something that Greg pointed to earlier. You know, when you were reading this account, you're supposed to put yourself in the position of all the characters, including the mob. You don't get to say, well, the mob was Jews. It's like, well, that's real convenient for you. The mob's the mob. It's not identified with, it's actually the breakdown of everything that would make Jews Jews, right? It's the breakdown of that communal spirit. It's the breakdown of that central unity.
That's what mobs do when they burn down their own cities and towns. It's generational laying waste.
And we need to be careful about what the term "the Jews" means at this particular time, because some of those talking about hoiudoioi are themselves Jewish, if we're looking at them, ethnically or in I mean, so sometimes, I know this is not an excuse for what has happened, but just in terms of the context here, the polemic against the Jews is a complicated one because it's internal to a Hebraic Jewish context.
It's like the polemic against the Pharisees. It's like, it isn't the Pharisees here. The Pharisees are religious hypocrites. It happens to be that in this story, they're the Pharisees, and maybe the biggest temptation for the Pharisaic tradition was religious hypocrisy. But to think that the only religious hypocrites are the Pharisees, that's what that story means.
Or that all
that's just
Pharisees are
mad.
religious hypocrites. That's also
Right, it also doesn't mean that. Right.
It's a heartbreaking thread in the history of Christianity. There's no getting around it, Dennis. I think the question is, to what extent is that consistent with the message we're getting elsewhere in the gospel? And to what extent is it consistent with Jesus' claim that he's brought an end to the cycle, the endless cycle of curses and bloodshed?
Jesus would have been killed by the Christian mob.
A Christian mob is killing Jesus by being a mob, right? So,
Okay with me?
yeah. All right, here we go. The soldiers mocked Jesus, Matthew 27 to 30. So the governor's soldiers took Jesus into the palace known as the Praetorium, and they assembled all the soldiers of the guard around him. They stripped Jesus, they clothed him in a scarlet cloak, and put a purple robe on him. They plaited together a crown of thorns and put it on his head, and they put a reed staff in his right hand. Then they knelt before him as if in homage and mocked him, saying, "Hail, King of the Jews." Then they took the reed and began to strike him on the head with it, and they spat upon him and they slapped him in the face. Final appeal in the death sentence, Matthew 27 to 31. But then Pilate had second thoughts. He went out once more and said to the crowd, "Behold, I'm bringing him out to you so that you may see that I cannot find any grounds for a charge against him." Then Jesus came out wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe, and Pilate said to them, "Look at the man." But when the chief priests and the officials saw him, they cried out, "Crucify him! Crucify him!" Pilate said to them, "Take him yourself and crucify him, for I find no crime in him." They answered him, "We have a law, and by that law he ought to die, because he has called himself the Son of God." When Pilate heard these words, he became all the more afraid. He went back into the palace and asked Jesus, "Where are you from?" But Jesus gave no answer. Pilate therefore said to him, "You will not speak to me? Do you not understand that I have the power to release you and the power to crucify you?" Jesus answered him, "You would have no power over me at all unless it had been given to you from above. Therefore, the one who handed me over to you bears an even greater sin than yours." From then on, Pilate tried to set Jesus free, but the crowd cried out loudly, "If you release this man, you are no friend of Caesar. Everyone who calls himself a king is speaking against Caesar." When Pilate heard these words, he brought Jesus out, and he sat down in the judgment seat at the place called the Stone Pavement, or in Hebrew, Gabbatha. It was the day of preparation for the Passover in the morning. Pilate said to the crowd, "Here is your king." They cried out, away with him, crucify him." Pilate asked them, "Shall I crucify your king?" The chief priests answered, "We have no king but Caesar." Then Pilate delivered Jesus up to their will. After the soldiers had finished mocking him, they stripped him of the purple robe and put his own clothes back on him. Then they led him away to crucify him. Well, this plays out the kingship drama, right? There's a parody of kingship here, and very complex symbolism, for example, in the crown of thorns.
Yeah, the crown of thorns to me is one of the deepest symbols in the Bible, because the thorns are the result of the fall, right? When Adam and Eve fall, it says the Lord will provide thorns. You can understand thorns as the multiplicity of points, right? It's like fragmented, violent, dangerous points instead of one point at the top of the hill, right? That's a way to understand it. It's violent, dangerous multiplicity. And so Jesus takes the consequence of the fall and sets it up as a crown. And you know, the way that I've been trying to show this whole seminar, that seems to be what Jesus is doing all the time, constantly showing that in the brokenness, the glory of God shows. And this is one of the deepest images of that.